We've looked at the phenomenalist view, according to which the world is a mental phenomenon. There is no world external to minds. That would definitely be one end of the spectrum. Berkeley's idealism, or phenomenalism as it's also called, is definitely at one end of the spectrum. As I said at the outset of this unit of the course, there's a spectrum of views. There's a range of views that you can take on this issue of the relation between the mind and the world. And Berkeley's idealism would definitely be one end. As I've also said, Descartes and Locke try to defend a moderate, intermediate position. I would say indirect realism falls in the middle of the spectrum. Here again, broadly, the idea that the external world is the theory according to which the external world is real. A mind-independent world of material substances is something real, but we get at it only very indirectly. And so in many respects, the world is not like the way that it's given to us in experience. So we've seen that Locke makes out this gap between things in themselves on the one hand and the objects of our experience on the other hand. Makes it out in terms of the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, and Descartes comes down on a very similar breakdown of things. The opposite end of the spectrum, direct realism, would, of course, have in common with indirect realism that an external world is real, a world external to minds. A mind-independent world of material substances is something real. But just as Berkeley finds it implausible that there's this twofold nature to the objects, on the one hand, the real thing, the thing in itself, and on the other hand, the object of experience, which is different from, perhaps radically different from, the actual thing in the world. Just as Berkeley found that twofold nature to objects, physical objects, corporeal objects, implausible, not believable. Reid, at the opposite end of the spectrum, has much the same criticism of indirect realism. He also finds it implausible that there is this twofold, this duplicity to all the familiar objects of our ordinary experience. And so, even though they're at opposite ends of the spectrum, Reid and Berkeley have a lot in common. They both reject the indirect realist view in some cases for the same reasons. But then they, from the implausibility as they see it, of indirect realism, they draw quite different conclusions. They draw opposite conclusions. Berkeley believes that we do have knowledge of the objects of the world, but the objects in the world are composed of sensible properties, and sensible properties don't exist outside of minds. Therefore, the world does not exist outside of minds, the idealist view. Bodies are bundles of ideas. Ideas don't exist outside of minds. Therefore, the world is a bundle of ideas. The world is a mental phenomenon. We've seen that that was Berkeley's view. Here again, idealism or phenomenalism is definitely one end of the spectrum. Reid draws the opposite lesson from what he too sees as the shaky foundations of indirect realism. He thinks that the best inference, we ought to infer that the world just is the way that it's given to us in experience. So we have some selections from Reid's essays on the intellectual powers of man. Reid is an 18th century Scottish philosopher, like Hume, contemporary with Hume, but certainly at the opposite end of the spectrum from Hume in lots of ways as well. Reid believes that a mind-independent world of material substances is real, and we get at it directly. The way that it's given to us in experience is the way that it is. So how does he argue for this view? Definitely you have to argue for that view, because we've seen in Descartes and Locke that with respect to the sensible properties by which we know things, it seems like at least a lot of them are ephemeral. They're in flux. They come and go, and so never really were essential to the object itself. So it's not hard to think of examples like that. We've seen lots of examples in Descartes and Locke. So it's not immediately obvious that this view is correct. It's a view for which one has to argue, and that is what Reid does. He's a proponent of direct realism. And his argument for it is subtle. It doesn't appeal to the content of experience in quite the way that you might think. It's a subtle argument, so let's dig into it. Reid says in our selections that the clear and distinct testimony of our senses carries irresistible conviction along with it. This conviction is not only irresistible, but it is immediate. We ask no argument for the existence of the object, but that we perceive it. So his point is that perception causes us to believe in objects that exist external to mind. And why is that the case? Why would that be the case? Well, the best explanation for that fact is that the objects of perception exist external to mind. That's the best explanation for why perception works the way that it does. According to Reid, we have to believe that our senses, our perceptual faculties, we have to believe that they are trustworthy. We have to believe that they show us the world the way that it is. But here again, he doesn't appeal to the content of perceptual experience to make that argument, because of course Locke and Berkeley are empiricists as well. They think experience is the source of knowledge. So that's not going to decide the matter one way or the other. Rather than looking at the content of experience, he compares the situation that we're in when we use our perceptual faculties, our powers of sight and hearing and so forth. The situation that we're in is on a par with the situation that we're in when it comes to formal branches of inquiry like logic and math, geometry, arithmetic, logic, and in the natural sciences as well. With respect to all these formal branches of inquiry, in the case of math, logic, or when it comes to the empirical sciences as well, in every domain of knowledge, in every branch of inquiry, there are certain framework principles. There are certain foundational principles. Principles that simply have to be accepted before inquiry can proceed, before investigation can move forward. You simply have to accept first principles. And the first principles themselves are first in the sense that they can't be derived from anything simpler. They can't be derived from anything more basic. And this is true of every branch of inquiry. Reid often gives examples from mathematics. And he says that just as to do Euclidean geometry, for example, you have to start from certain axioms, that is to say, first principles that themselves cannot be proved in the system. Similarly, when it comes to our inquiry into the world around us, when it comes to our investigations of the physical world around us, we have to accept as an intuitively self-evident first principle or axiomatic principle that our senses show us the way that the world is. If we don't accept that to begin with, then we can't come to know the nature of the world. And in the natural sciences, we do come to know a great deal about the nature of the world. How is that possible? It's only possible on the supposition, according to Reid, that our senses are trustworthy, that our senses show us the way Show us the world the way that it is. He says, our belief in the axioms, here again, this is an analogy between the situation that we're in when it comes to our knowledge of the physical world, on the one side of the analogy, and the way that we operate in formal branches of knowledge, like math and logic. He draws an analogy between the two cases. Our belief of the axioms in mathematics is not grounded upon argument. Arguments are grounded upon them. But their evidence is discerned immediately by the human understanding. The conviction is equally immediate and equally irresistible in both cases. No man thinks of seeking a reason to believe what he sees. So here again, perception causes us to believe that what we see is the case. What is the best explanation for that fact? Well, we have to take it as a first principle of inquiry into the natural world, that our senses are trustworthy, that our faculties of perception show us the world the way that it is. So I have an illustration of the parallel postulate here, say for example. Early on in the foundational work of geometry, Euclid's Elements, early on, Euclid puts forward the parallel postulate as axiomatic, as a postulate. The literal sense of that term postulate comes from the Latin verb I demand. The idea being that before you can construct proofs in Euclidean geometry, and this goes, of course, for any branch of formal knowledge, any branch of formal inquiry, before you can construct proofs in logic, before you can construct proofs in number theory, set theory, any branch of math, you have to be willing to stipulate certain first principles. That's the sense of postulate, from the Latin postulo, I demand. I demand that first we lay down these first principles before inquiry can proceed and we can begin to construct proofs. To construct a proof, you're always citing some principle that itself cannot be proven. If the principles on which you're relying themselves have to be proven, then it would not be possible to ever construct a proof, because you would have to back up to justify each premise ad infinitum. You would have to back up forever. You would have to trace your steps backwards forever. If from premise 1 and premise 2 you show that a certain conclusion follows, someone might well say, well, why is premise 1 true? Okay, maybe you give an argument for the truth of premise 1. You'll recall that I did that kind of thing in looking at Aquinas' version of the cosmological argument, for example. I gave you some of the background, some of the intellectual history behind some of the premises. Say, for example, why can't anything be the source of its own motion? Well, Aquinas could argue for the truth of that premise by appealing to the distinction between potentiality and actuality. So we discussed that case in point, for example. So if someone challenges you to defend the truth of your premises, of course you can do that. But you can't do that forever. If someone says, if you say, well, premise 1 is true because of X, well, of course, then the question could just as easily arise, well, why is X true? What is your argument for that? Well, X is true because of Y. Well, what is your argument for the truth of premise Y? This obviously can go on forever, right? But if we are going to construct proofs, then we can't go backwards forever. We can't keep tracing our steps backwards forever. X is justified because of Y. Y is justified because of Z. Z is justified because of A. If you're going to construct a proof, at some point you have to take certain principles as first principles, principles that themselves do not admit of proof. So Reid's analogy is with the situation that we're in with respect to formal branches of knowledge. Say, for example, geometry. Here's an illustration of the parallel postulate. Early on in the Elements, Euclid says that if two lines intersect a third in such a way as to form acute angles on the same side, then necessarily those lines converge. Now, in Euclid's Elements, here again, that principle is introduced as axiomatic. It can't be proven in the sense that of being derived from some more basic principle or some more basic sets of, or some set of more basic principles. That's what is meant in calling it axiomatic. It's a first principle. It simply has to be accepted before proofs in Euclidean geometry can begin. And then he goes on to construct proofs. Euclid goes on to construct proofs of many other claims. But if one is to construct a proof, here again, one has to begin from first principles. The same is true in logic. The same is even true in the natural sciences, even where claims can be verified one way or the other, verified or refuted by empirical evidence. Still, the framework principles of the natural sciences have to be accepted before inquiry can begin. Take, for example, the foundational principle of the natural sciences that every effect must have a cause. That is taken as a framework principle, or here again is axiomatic, before inquiry into the natural world can even begin. It has to be accepted as a first principle or axiomatic, because all the time scientists fail to discover the cause of some phenomenon. When they try to determine the cause of some phenomenon and fail to do so, they don't throw up their hands and say, oh, well, I guess this phenomenon is caused by nothing at all. Here's an example of an effect without a cause. No, they never do that. What do? They say, well, we haven't discovered the cause. That just goes to show that the principle, every effect must have a cause, is accepted as a first principle or a framework principle before inquiry into the natural world begins. If it weren't accepted as something that itself cannot be proven but simply has to be stipulated as axiomatic, then here again inquiry could not proceed, because there are all kinds of counterexamples. Every time scientists fail to discover the cause of some phenomenon, that's a counterexample. But they don't believe that there's no cause for the phenomenon. They just realize that they haven't yet discovered the cause, and they have to go back to the drawing board and try again. That just goes to show that it's not an empirical claim, because if one were accepting it on the basis of empirical considerations, what the empirical evidence shows, what observation, what experiment, what they show, then there would be just as much counter evidence to the principle as evidence, and yet it's always accepted by scientists. Scientific research, empirical research in the natural sciences presupposes that that is true. So it has to be accepted as axiomatic. So our belief in the axioms in mathematics is not grounded upon argument. Arguments are grounded upon them. Now, here again, according to Reid, that's not a problem, because their evidence, the evidence of first principles, is immediate. We are directly aware, immediately aware. We have a kind of pure intuition, purely rational insight, or pure intuition, as it's sometimes called, a kind of immediate, direct awareness of the truth of certain propositions. So the parallel postulate would be an example from geometry. In the case of arithmetic, say for example the commutativity of multiplication, something like a times b is equal to b times a, where a and b are variables, and you substitute the same value for the same variable, that is always going to be an identity. That is always going to be an equivalence, right? Here again, that's intuitively self-evident. You just think about it, and you see the necessary truth of it. Maybe you run through a few examples to kind of help you see the truth of it, but the truth of it doesn't depend on the examples, right? Because it isn't possible to substitute every possible value for those two variables, is it? And yet you know that it's always going to work. That's what is meant by this idea of an immediate understanding, a direct kind of immediate flash of intuition where you just do see the necessary truth of that principle. So we do have to begin from first principles that themselves cannot be proven. But Reid's point is that that's not a problem. That fact should not generate any skeptical worry that maybe the foundation of our knowledge is unstable. It's not a problem because the truth of first principles is immediate. First principles are intuitively self-evident, such as that every effect must have a cause. Here again, any foundational principle in a natural science, like every effect must have a cause. Any foundational principle in a branch of math, in the case of arithmetic, say for example the commutativity of multiplication, can't be derived from anything simpler. The parallel postulate in Euclidean geometry, again, can't be derived from anything simpler. In every branch of inquiry, certain first principles have to be accepted. In the case of logic, say for example, rules of inference, basic rules of inference like disjunctive syllogism, P or Q, not P, therefore Q. That is a valid form of inference is intuitively self-evident. And it's arguably the case that it can't be derived from any principles that are simpler. So logic, math, even the natural sciences, there are always first principles that we must accept as axiomatic before inquiry can begin. And their truth is immediate. That fact, here again, that we have to rely on principles that themselves cannot be proven, shouldn't cause any skeptical doubt about the foundations of our knowledge, because their truth is immediate. It's intuitively self-evident. And so Reid is saying that with respect to our understanding of the world around us, when it comes to our understanding of the external world, the trustworthiness of our senses, the premise that our perceptual faculties show us the way that the world is, that simply has to be accepted as axiomatic. That simply has to be accepted as a first principle. And a consequence of that is that Reid rejects Locke's view, the indirect realist view, according to which the immediate object of awareness is an idea. We saw Locke say that a lot. Here again, the immediate object of awareness is an idea. We saw Descartes say that as well, not in the same words, not in the same terminology, but we saw that Descartes' version of indirect realism is very similar in some respects. Here again, the indirect realist view would be you don't hear the car going down the street. What you hear is a sound, and from the sound you infer that there's a car going down the street. The immediate object of awareness is some idea. You don't see the apple on the desk. You see a certain combination of color and shape, and you infer that the cause of it is an apple. So we saw that's the indirect realist view. Reid thinks if we accept that trustworthiness in our senses is axiomatic, has to be accepted as a first principle, then the immediate object of awareness is not some psychological item, some idea or bundle of ideas or set of sense impressions. The immediate object of awareness is a thing in the world. We get at the world directly. Reid says it is very natural to ask whether it is not possible for men to think of things which are not ideas in the mind. That, in so many words, is what we saw Locke say. The immediate object of awareness is some idea or bundle of ideas, and from that we infer the real thing in itself, the material substance on the other side of the ideas. Reid finds that implausibly complicated. Locke's theory seems to imply, as Reid says, that every object of thought must be an idea and can be nothing else. Which is to say, we never actually get at the world, and that we never actually get at the world, but are always inferring it from ideas. Reid does not find that believable. Reid does not find that credible. Reid finds it implausible. What he finds implausible, among other things, about the indirect view, the indirect version of realism, is the duplicity, the twofold nature that sensible objects have in that theory, in Locke's theory. In Locke's theory, there are really two objects of thought. The idea, which is in the mind, which we saw Locke say many times is the immediate object of awareness, and then the object, the thing in itself, the material substance in the world, distinct from our perception of it. So again, in Locke's theory, there are two objects of thought, the idea, which is in the mind, and the object represented by that idea. The first, that is to say the idea or bundle of ideas, the first, the immediate object of thought, the last, the object of the same thought, but not the immediate object. So the thing in the world is not the immediate object of thought. The immediate object of thought, on the Lockean view, the immediate object is our own idea or bundle of ideas. But here again, Reid does not find that plausible. We are directly aware, his view is that we are directly aware, immediately aware of objects in the world. And our senses show them to us just the way they are. Reid says, this twofold nature to everything, this duplicity to everything, this is not believable. Reid writes, this is a hard saying, for it makes every thought of things external to have a double object. So for all the objects in the world that you know, there's a twofold nature to them on the indirect realist view. But Reid does not believe that, there's a twofold nature to everything. That would be the case, though, if indirect realism were true. That's his argument. Every man is conscious of his thoughts, and yet, upon attentive reflection, he perceives no such duplicity in the object he thinks about. So, in a way, Reid does appeal to the content of experience after he's established the subtler argument that we have to accept the trustworthiness of our senses as axiomatic. After he's made the argument that way, then he goes on to further observe that if indirect realism were true, we would perceive this duplicity. We would be conscious of this twofold nature to everything. Every object would be a kind of double object. The thing in itself, which is the material substance on the other side of the sense impressions, and then the bundle of sense impressions or ideas on the other side of that. But that's not what we experience. We just experience things in the world. We just experience the objects themselves. Given that fact, given that we do not experience this duplicity, this twofold to everything, it must be the case, according to Reid, that our perceptual faculties, our senses, show the world to us the way that it is. They show us the world the way that it is. Reid offers an analogy. If there were this twofold nature to all the objects of our experience, all the ordinary mundane objects in the physical world around us, if there were this twofold nature to them all, we would be conscious of that. And it would be like the case of signs and the things that the signs signify. Reid says, it seems very hard to understand what is meant by an object of thought that is not an immediate object of thought. And he goes on to argue that we have some sense of how such a relation would work in the case of a sign on the one hand and the thing signified on the other hand. So again, the indirect realist view is that the immediate object of thought is a sensation, an idea, a sense impression, call it what you will, some psychological item, and then we infer the object that is the cause of the sense impression or the idea or bundle of ideas. We say things, you're sitting in your living room, the curtains are drawn, you hear a car go down the street, you say all the time things like, oh, I hear the car. But that's, as we've seen on the indirect view, that's elliptical for I hear certain sounds and I infer from them that there's a car causing them. Or here again, we see all the time things like I see the apple on the desk. But that's really elliptical for I see certain sensible qualities, certain combinations of color and shape. And I infer that an apple is the cause of those ideas, those sense impressions. Here again, that's the indirect view. Reid says, if that were true, then here again there would be this twofold nature to everything. It would be a little bit like a sign on the one hand and the thing represented by the sign on the other hand, and that's not what we experience. We just directly experience objects. If everything were had this twofold nature, if there were this duplicity to all the objects of our experience, then it would be like this relation between sign and thing signified, which we do have some sense of. We do have a sense of what that's like. But that's not in general what our experience is like. We do have some sense of how that would work. So say, for example, you're driving down 85 South and you see this sign. What would you infer? Well, you would infer that you're coming up on an airport, right? But the thing signified, as Reid points out, so in this case, the airport is the thing signified by the sign, right? The thing signified, as Reid says, when it is introduced to thought, is an object of thought, no less immediate than the sign was before. There are here two objects of thought. So the sign itself is an object of thought, and what it represents, the airport, is also an object of thought. So in the relation between sign and signified, for example, there is a twofold. There is a kind of double object. But we're directly aware of both objects. We're directly aware of both the sign and the thing that it represents and the thing that is signified. But that's not in general true of our knowledge of objects in the world. With respect to the ordinary mundane cases of the familiar objects around us, cats and dogs, trees, houses, rocks, we just do immediately immediately apprehend in thought the object itself, not some twofold. First a bundle of sense impressions that represent it, and then the object itself that is the cause of those sense impressions. That's not how we experience the world. So he does appeal to the content of experience in a way to show that if indirect realism were true, then the content of experience would be different from the experience that is familiar to us. Reid, of course, doesn't deny that there are ideas in the sense of images formed as a kind of mental picture of the object, but that's secondary. That's not the immediate relation of the mind to the world. So you can picture the object of experience in your mind when it's not present, of course. But that's not what's going on when we directly encounter the object, when we directly apprehend in thought an object. We're not directly in contact with something mental, with something psychological, a mental picture. That's not what is going on when we just directly perceive the object in the world. So he doesn't deny that there are ideas, but he denies that ideas are, as he puts it, the objects of those operations. That is to say, the operations of perceiving things in the world. The object of perception, the kind of operations that we're engaged in when we use our perceptual faculties, our sense of sight, and touch, and taste, and smell, and sound. The objects of those operations are things in the world, not psychological entities, not mental entities, but rather things in the world external to mind. The objects of perception, Reid says, by all who acknowledge their existence are called real things, not ideas. So this is sometimes called common sense realism, sometimes in the literature Scottish common sense realism, because it's closely associated with a number of Scottish thinkers, a school of Scottish thinkers in the 18th century of whom Reid was the most prominent. Direct realism, common sense realism goes by both of these names. And here again, Reid begins from the premise that the distinction between thoughts on the one hand, which here again are psychological items or mental items, and the things that our thoughts are of on the other hand. This is again one of the axiomatic first principles of inquiry into the world around us. It's just intuitively self-evident. It's intuitively self-evident that there's a distinction between our thoughts on the one hand and the things that they are of on the other hand. Yes, my thought is not the same thing as the object, but it doesn't follow from that when I'm directly aware of an object in the world that I'm thinking about my thoughts. I'm thinking about the thing in the world. So this is another, here again, of those intuitively self-evident axiomatic first principles that simply have to be accepted, just like the parallel postulate in Euclidean geometry, or the commutativity of multiplication in arithmetic or number theory, that disjunctive syllogism is a valid rule of inference in logic, in the natural sciences, that for every effect there is a cause, or maybe even in metaphysics, the whole is greater than the part. That would be a first principle of mereology, the branch of metaphysics that deals with parts and wholes. The transitivity of parthood in metaphysics. Here again, if x is a part of y and y is a part of z, then x is a part of z. Transitivity of parthood would be another first principle. Here again, I'm sure you can think of examples of that, but before you even think of any examples, you see the truth of that proposition, don't you? You just intuitively have a direct, immediate awareness of the truth of that proposition. If x is a part of y and y is a part of z, then x is a part of z. So just think about it for a moment. It's intuitively self-evident that that's true, isn't it? Then I'm sure you can think of an example. My thumb is a part of my hand hand is a part of my body, therefore my thumb is a part of my body, right? The transitivity of parthood, say for example in metaphysics, is an intuitively self-evident first principle. So here again, in every branch of inquiry, there are certain axioms. And we have to accept as axiomatic, according to Reid, that our senses reveal to us the way that the world is, that our senses are trustworthy, that they show us the world the way that it is. We are just, let me put it this way, we are just directly aware of objects in the world. We don't infer them from some intermediary phenomenon, namely psychological entities like ideas or sense impressions. Again, it's sometimes called common sense realism. Common sense has in it innate principles of judgment. What is meant by common sense here, as Reid uses the term, as it's used in this context by philosophers, common sense means having to do with universal principles of judgment. Principles of judgment that are just intrinsic to the human mind, innate to the human mind. So that's what common sense means in this context. It's not common sense in the sense that you more often kind of hear that phrase. You usually hear it in association with prudential judgment, practical wisdom, prudence, right? Something like, if my cousin Jimbo had more common sense, he wouldn't have thought it was a good idea to pet that alligator. Something like that, right? That's not what Reid means by common sense. Common sense in this context means having to do with first principles of judgment that are innate to the human mind, that are intrinsic to all minds. So common sense has in it innate principles of judgment. That the focus of awareness and perceptual experience as an object in the world is one such principle. Perceptual experience causes belief in physical objects. And that it does so is simply a feature of the innate structure of the human mind, the innate structure of a kind of universal power of judgment, or here again, a kind of common sense. Again, the title of the work from which these selections is taken is Essays on the Intellectual Powers of Man, that is to say, of human beings, of mankind. All human beings have certain intrinsic to their mind, certain, here again, inborn, innate principles of judgment. And one of them, according to Reid, is that the focus of awareness and perceptual experience is not something psychological. It's an object in the world, an object in a world external to mind. Physical objects are given in experience, and they're just given to us in experience directly the way that they are. Their existence is not inferred from some intermediary phenomenon. Here again, we saw that that was the indirect realist view. There is an object in the world, it's something real, But we're not directly aware of it. We infer it from some intermediary phenomenon in the indirect view, right? The intermediary phenomenon would be our idea or our bundle of ideas. So we've seen that as the indirect view. Reid denies that. Physical objects are just given to us in experience. Their existence is not inferred from some intermediary phenomenon, like a bundle of sense impressions or a bundle of ideas. We have direct contact with the material world. The working of common sense is such that sensation causes immediate belief in the object given in sensation. What is the best explanation for that fact? It's a fact that perception causes us to believe in objects that exist external to mind. Well, I take it as reasonably uncontroversial that that's a fact. Berkeley would deny that, but let's stipulate that that is the case. That's the way perception works. It causes us to believe in objects that are external to mind. If we stipulate that as a fact, then what is the best explanation for that fact? Why is that the case? Again, according to Reid, the best explanation for that fact is that perception shows us objects in an external world. Perception reveals to us objects in a world external to mind. That's the best explanation for the way that perception works. There's an example in Hume, and Hume is a kind of, as we've seen, a kind of radical empiricist like Berkeley. His view is very similar to, maybe even the same as, depending on your interpretation of Hume, maybe even the same as Berkeley's, according to which the objects of our experience don't exist outside of minds. Objects are composed of sense impressions, ideas. Ideas don't exist outside of minds, therefore the objects of our experience don't exist outside of minds. And Hume tries to make that argument by giving the example of looking at a table from different distances. The size of a table, here again, big or small, that doesn't exist outside of a mind, according to Hume, and that was Berkeley's view as well. Up close it seems big, far away it seems small. What is the fact of the matter? Is it big or small? Big or small doesn't exist outside of a perceiving subject. It doesn't exist outside of a perceiving mind. And Hume goes on to say that, as you walk further away from the table, it appears to shrink. It appears to get smaller as you walk away from it. Well, that just goes to show, according to Hume, that the immediate object of awareness is an idea. Because you don't think that the table itself is shrinking. That just goes to show that, here again, we're immediately aware of ideas and not material substances somehow on the other side of the ideas. A material substance, by hypothesis, would be something that exists independent of mind, so it should undergo no change depending on the point of view of the perceiving mind. And yet, here again, bodies do undergo all kinds of changes depending on point of view, depending on close or far, depending on the distance of the perceiver from the object. Here again, as we've talked about, all kinds of ways that other perceptual qualities change depending on changes in the perceiving subject, right? Objects don't have colors in the dark, so depending on the perceptual conditions, the sensible properties may just go out of existence. Hot water doesn't feel hot if your hands have been in cold water for 5 minutes before you put them in hot water. The hot water won't feel hot. That just goes to show that hot or cold aren't really in the water, they're really just in us. All these kinds of arguments that you associate with empiricism, that you associate with thinkers like Locke and Hume and Berkeley. All these arguments purport to show that the immediate object of awareness is some idea or bundle of ideas, not something in the world, distinct from the ideas. Well, Reid takes that same example from Hume, and he says, let us suppose that it is not, let us suppose that it is the real table we see. Must not this real table seem to diminish as we remove further from it? Reid's point is that that's the way our perceptual faculty of sight works. We should expect the real table to appear to diminish as we remove further from it, because that's the way that our visual faculty works. As the distance increases, the image formed decreases. That's just the way that our perceptual faculty works, so that's what we should expect to happen. Reid's argument is that it doesn't follow from that we're not perceiving the real thing in the world, the thing itself. He says when that which must happen to the real table when we remove further from it does actually happen to the table we see, it is absurd to conclude from this that it is not the real table we see. So Reid looks at the same fact. These very different philosophers look at the same set of facts and come away with different conclusions. And that is, of course, characteristic of so much of life. Two people can agree on all the facts and still draw different lessons from those facts, still come to different conclusions. That's characteristic of philosophy. That's, of course, characteristic of so much of life.